Hello and welcome. This is Confronting Caste, an initiative of the King's India Institute at King's College London. I am Srilata Sarkar, and I will be hosting a series of conversations to expand engagement with ongoing research on caste as a system of social power. Today we have with us Dr. Shivani Kapoor, a political scientist and assistant professor at the Center for Writing Studies at the Jindal Global University in Sonipat, India. Hi, Shivani, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Srilata. Thanks for doing this and for calling me to have this conversation. Really excited to be talking to you in the next few hours.
Well, very glad to have you. As we start, let's go back a little bit in time to when you first started your PhD research at JNU. You wrote your thesis about the leather industry in Agra and Kanpur and Unnao and other sites. And you looked at the political economy, so the set of relationships that make up the industry, not just individual relationships, but at the societal level, the way societal groups work with each other to put together this industry. So, what brought you to this topic, and how did leather become the material that anchored your research?
Right. Thanks for that question, Srilata, because it really takes me back to the beginnings of research, which was beginnings of this research, which was largely around 2011-12, when I first started thinking of what to do for the PhD. And by that time, I had already written an MPhil, also at JNU, and the MPhil was on. um looking at the question of the untouchable self, the question of the Dalit self in Hindi Dalit autobiographies. Um, so that really, I mean, reading that whole range of literature and writing about it was really my first entry point into what I did with the PhD, which is with the leather industry. Because um, a lot of these autobiographies, um, stories, essays, and of course, we tend to think that a lot of the stories and essays which come out of the Dalit life world are also autobiographical, even though they may not be slotted as autobiographies per se. And so, a lot of these narratives were uh, were also written around the question of objects and their relationship to caste, and by what I mean by that is really that, of course, these narratives mm, have a lot to say about, uh, like you said, societal interactions, have a lot to say about caste as a structure and a system. Uh, they are rich with, very rich phenomenological sort of experiential accounts of what it means to have a Dalit life world, inhabit a Dalit life world, and so on and so forth. But what was also there, which was standing out really, was the fact that in a lot of Dalit lives, and I must say by extension in a lot of Savarna lives as well, caste is manifested through the objects around us, not just the people and the relationships, but the objects. And by objects, I mean, um, things which are considered pure and impure, things which will have a certain place in the house and will not be kept at another place. uh thing by objects and things, I would also say very mundane objects of everyday life, something like a turban or a pagdi, as we say in Hindi and other languages. Who wears a turban? And what color your turban can be, whether you can even wear one or not, whether you can ride a horse or not, how high is the wall of your house. I mean, caste seemed to materialize not just in literature, but in what we were reading around us, in the news that is happening around us, in our own lives. Caste is manifesting through these very mundane everyday objects. And there is a way in which these everyday objects of life acquire a caste status, or if not a caste status, they acquire a place in uh, the playing out of caste in the caste system or structure, as we call it. Now that is something which really fascinated me while writing the MPhil, as to how is it that these rules get formed and how do these rules get implemented, um, and how is caste transacted through these rules and norms and practices, that your wall can be only 5 feet high so that basically everybody can look into your house, right? Or the women in your community will not wear gold, apart from the fact that they can't probably afford gold. Even if they can, they will not wear gold because gold is the symbol of prosperity, and you're not supposed to um, sort of inhabit or have any signs of prosperity because you ostensibly are lower caste. um, and this was fascinating for me in order to understand how is it that caste is transacted in the everyday relations of caste. So leather, actually, because I was reading Dalit autobiographies and because I was reading Dalit autobiographies written in Hindi specifically, um, a lot of these autobiographies were coming from primarily two communities. One is the Jatav Chamar community, uh, who are the leather workers in large parts of western UP, and this is the community which has historically benefited the most, at least in a state like Uttar Pradesh. It has benefited the most from affirmative action policies, from reservations, and has historically, because of their connection with leatherwork, they have historically been able to take benefit from they have been able to benefit from the kind of modernity and also a little bit of economic prosperity that leatherwork brought. Arise because especially because leatherwork is deeply connected to the colonial state, the economy of the colonial state, as well as the economy of the post-colonial state. And so the Jatav Chamars in western UP are one community which are now able to have some amount of education, some amount of access to urban spaces, to urban sort of urban modern spaces like publishing, translation, uh, you know, even thinking of writing something in a book form or publishing something in a magazine. Um, so, these modes are not easily available to everyone still, and the Jatav Chamar community has been able to somewhat get access to these resources, and so naturally their autobiographies and their literature is predominant in the Hindi speaking part of western UP, at least. The other community whose narratives I found to be quite available um, were the Valmiki community, which is the community which um, I mean, in the sort of traditional, quote unquote, traditional work scheme, is supposed to do manual scavenging, right? And they are, of course, a much more marginalized and much more oppressed community in the context of northern India. But we have some very, very powerful accounts from the Valmiki community as well. So these were primarily the two kinds of texts that I read. And it and again, in both of these communities, there are certain objects and certain practices which have to do with their trade, uh, that stood out in these narratives. How much a piece of hide or skin, or how much a leather shoe, or say something like the broom that you use for sweeping, the spade that you use for cleaning drains, right? The fact that you immerse your entire body into a sewage drain, and the sensorial experience, the humiliation, the degradation in that. um, these experiences were of course predominant in these narratives, and so I got very interested in leather per se, out of these narratives. um, I think that has probably also got to do with the fact that I grew up in Agra, which is a shoemaking hub in India. uh, and it is one of the biggest centers for footwear manufacture. And so I had grown up in that city, although I had no connections to that trade, neither did my family. But uh, but I had seen it all around me, and I mean, practically speaking, could think of it as a field site as well, because there was some amount of familiarity with the city. So so leather became very interesting, and then I thought how to operationalize leather. I mean, how do I even operationalize the question that um, leather as an object not only has caste, but it is crucial in the transaction of caste. How do I operationalize this question into something which can be researched? Um, and of course, this is how the question begins to take shape. Um, and again, I dipped back into some of this literature and some of these narratives to find that, leather work, specifically speaking, not finished leather, but not the consumption of leather, but leather work is primarily experienced through the body and through the senses, right? It is the entire body of the leather worker which sort of immerses itself into the process of tanning, into the process of making leather, of working, of making commodities out of leather. And so it was body and the senses which I thought was very useful and helpful in being able to think about the connection between the object and the caste body and the physical body and the social body. And so I then started reading up more and thinking about the question of the senses, the body, leather work, and of course the entire sort of apparatus of caste. So that's how it sort of came about, and which is why uh, I really think that the literature produced by the Dalit community was extremely crucial in making these connections for me, in pointing me to this direction that there's something more than just the political economy of leather. There's something more than leather being an industrial commodity. There's something else happening here which doesn't happen with many other industrial commodities, and thus leather becomes very interesting. Becomes a very interesting way in which you can approach the question of caste.
That's really interesting what you said about the material aspect of caste, the fact that it features in everyday objects that probably all of us use in our everyday lives. And those of us who come from a privileged caste background are sort of completely oblivious to the caste element that these objects sort of embody. Um, so, kind of tracing that material aspect, could you maybe tell us about what sorts of sites your research took you to where these materials are produced? So if you can map the sites of the leather industry for us and tell us a bit about what sort of economic lives. I mean, you spoke a bit about tanning and how it's very bodily, and the body of the worker is central to the production of the material. If you can tell us a bit about what sort of economic lives and experiences, bodily experiences, create the leather industry.
Okay. Um, right. Before that, I mean, just one sort of. Mm, I just want to engage with something that you just said. Um, I don't think people who come from the upper castes are oblivious about the material status of some of these objects. I mean, uh, yeah, I belong to one such upper caste community, and that I think is again a very important entry point for me in doing a work like this. And so I also began to think about what is the status of, say, an object of leather in my kind of habitus, in my kind of life world. And I found that I think most of the people who come from upper caste communities are extremely aware of the caste status or the caste nature of some of these objects. Um, Leather, for instance, is not worn inside a lot of prominent Hindu temples, for instance. You can't even take a wallet or a purse or a belt inside some of these temples. And it is a practice that the upper caste willingly and very sort of unquestioningly take part in, right? Because it's almost as if it's assumed that leather is polluting to the temple premises, right? We have a certain, we also have a certain way in which we deal with shoes, and the way in which we deal with feet, where we think that feet itself are polluting, and thus shoes are polluting. Now, of course, these arguments also slip into the arguments about hygiene and sanitation, right? You can very quickly just say that, well, you don't bring shoes inside the house, or you don't keep your shoes on your table or on your bed because it's a hygiene issue. But we also know from a lot of work that people have done, a lot of research that people have done, that questions of hygiene, sanitation, and say questions of caste, race, gender, just sort of quickly map onto each other. And there are also ways in which hygiene and sanitation become codes for talking about uh, issues of caste or issues of gender or race. Um, and they become ways in which you don't have to address the humiliation or the degradation that this causes, but it becomes like what Mrs. Pandian would call code encoding of caste, literally. So yeah, I mean, and I'm saying this because while doing the research, it was very, very clear to me that um, that that leather as a commodity does cause a lot of disruption uh, at the level of every caste habitus. It is not as if the upper caste communities are sitting very easy with an object like leather, whether they are consumers or they are involved in the production process. Which brings me to the question that you asked, which is the sites of the leather industry and the economic and the bodily lives of those in the industry. Um, so, I mean, uh, at the offset, I must say that what we are calling the leather industry, in the industry itself, people think of it as two distinct industries actually. So there's the leather industry in the in terms of the on ground vocabulary. There is the leather industry, which is supposed to be the tanning industry actually, which is the tanning part of the operation, which starts from uh, procuring hides uh, from slaughtered or naturally fallen animals. Um, some of it could also, in some parts, this could also mean dealing with the animal carcass. So for smaller units or for tanning, which happens at the household level in villages and also in urban centers, uh, this process could also start with first dealing with the animal carcass, right? So there's a very close relationship between the animal body and the beginnings of the tanning industry, so to say. And we can talk more about this later. So the leather industry includes the tanning part of the operation, which means procuring the hide, salting the hide, which means you know literally putting salt on the hide so that it's preserved and all the bodily fluids are leached out. Sunning, putting them in sun, drying out the hide, and then the actual chemical process of tanning takes place. Tanning also takes place in two modes. Uh, One is vegetable tanning, which makes use of more natural dyes and tannins found in plant material. Uh, it used to be the most predominant mode of tanning, but not anymore because um, around the beginning of the 20th century, we discovered chemical tanning. And the most common form of chemical tanning is chrome tanning, which we follow all over the world today, also in India. And so, chrome tanning makes use of chemicals like chromium, to do the tanning. And what happens is that the tanning becomes much faster. It happens in a matter of days rather than weeks, which vegetable tanning would take. But it also produces a different kind of leather from what vegetable tanning would produce. So, a lot of leather that we see in the urban centers, a lot of leather that we see in handicraft stores, or these camel leather bags, or the mojeries or the jutis we see, they are mostly vegetable tanned leather. Uh, but when we move to our branded footwear and purses and wallets and all of that, that would be chemical tanned leather. So that part of the leather making process ends at um, a stage when the hide has been converted into what we know and see and feel as leather, right? Uh, at which point the so-called leather or the tanning industry ends and the footwear industry starts. The footwear or the whatever, the bag or the upholstery industry starts. And so on ground, the people who are involved in the footwear industry uh, are very, very sort of clear and adamant that we are not the leather industry, we are the footwear industry. The leather industry is the tanning part. Now, this is an interesting, I mean, this could be a technical division as well, but there are also caste connotations to this division as well, because the drastic change that supposedly happens uh, when a hide moves from being the skin of a dead animal to being a very beautiful roll of supposedly beautiful roll of this brown polished leather. um, it it is somewhere in that process that uh, the sort of caste and the caste nature and the sort of polluted nature of the object is perceived to change. And since the field I work in primarily speaks in Hindi, so the the term in Hindi was kacha chamda or pakka chamda, right? So raw leather and cooked leather. And we know from our reading of Hindu religious texts that fire is seen as a great purifier, right? So it is that process of cooking leather, which is not really ever cooked, but it's dipping into chemicals, and it's sort of long process in which it stops looking like animal skin anymore, and stops the rotting process. I mean, there's a point in this manufacturing where a leather is called wet blue, because after a certain amount of processing with chromium, leather literally looks like a blue sheet, and then it is processed again to make it into leather as we know it. So this wet blue, I figured, is literally the boundary of caste inside a tannery, because everything from animal hide to wet blue is seen as extremely polluting. And then again, by when I say pollution, it encapsulates the caste pollution and also what is known as environmental pollution, um, or sort of atmospheric pollution and all of that, right? So they also overlap. So these are also the processes. This part of the process is also what, say, consumes the most amount of water, because you have to wash the hides continuously. This is also the part of the process which is the most smelly. This is also the part of the process where you deal with organic material. So, the hide has hair, it has flesh, it has fat, it has blood. So, all of that is taken care of in this process, in this part of the process. Once it is wet blue, and then when it becomes finished leather, that's a different section. That's physically a different section in a tannery. Uh, Different sets of workers work on it. The wet section workers and the dry section workers do not interchange their work locations, they are separate. And of course, once the finished leather, reaches a factory, so it leaves the tannery and reaches a factory where it becomes a shoe or becomes a purse or becomes a sofa, then of course it is seen as a completely different product because it has nothing to do with the animal body. The animal body has literally been sort of burnt and washed out of that product. So that's one kind of division, the factory and the tannery, and the various sort of connotations that go along with these two spaces. Uh, the other sort of way in which to look at this entire bulk of the industry is to look at it in terms of who they are producing for. So there are India is a very sort of important exporter of leather goods. Okay. And they form a very large part of our foreign exchange earnings as well as GDP. So there are factories and tanneries which cater only to the export market, and those are, of course, the bigger, the sort of bigger establishments which have much larger capital backing them up. They're also parts of chains. So uh, you have your Park Tannery, which is an important export tannery. You have uh, uh, your branded footwear manufacturers who would only cater to the export market. There's a very large section, of course, of formal and informal tanneries and factories which cater to the domestic market. Uh, these are much smaller establishments. Sometimes they could be run from within households, especially in the case of making footwear. A lot of smaller domestic production footwear units are located inside individual homes, or they could be run in small one room or two room establishments. They are informal in the sense that they don't have a permanent workforce. They hire on a seasonal basis or on a order basis. Um, a lot of them are also outside the formal networks of taxation, land revenue, and this, that, and the other. And so that and this also includes a lot of rural level tanning and shoemaking operations, which I think will not even come under the informal economy as such, because they are just part of this household level production um, where the family may have a little land which they cultivate for subsistence. They may also do begar labor on the landlord's land, and because they have traditionally been passed down leather making in their family, they will also make a few shoes or make some sort of bags or something for industrial or agricultural use. But more importantly, these families would then also be involved in, like I said, taking care of animal carcasses. So at that level, these sorts of operations all come together in the same unit. So the family will take care of an animal carcass, skin it, make the hide into leather, also then make things out of leather. As we move more towards formal production, more towards cities, these operations get segregated, so to say. So, if I were to then just, list out the sites of the industry, keeping in mind all of these different divisions, the hide market would be one important site where the process actually starts. Some people would include the slaughterers into this as well, because slaughterers are our major source of hides, which again includes the smaller individual slaughterers and also the big slaughterhouses. But then again, there are differences between these two industries, and the leather industry thinks of itself as a uh, as somebody who takes care of the waste of the slaughtering industry. So hide markets is where hides are procured. Um these could be big hide markets like Hapur, which is one of the biggest hide markets in Uttar Pradesh. So it could be that, or it could be again a smaller informal level of hide collection, which happens from individual sort of slaughterers or individual household units and things like that. The next stage is the tannery, of course, where this entire process of converting a hide into leather takes place. From there, hides are taken to factories, different types of factories: footwear, upholstery, bags, garments, where all of this is then converted. And then there is, of course, the um, uh, the shops, the merchandisers basically who sell these products. So that's and then there's the consumer. So that's the chain. But within every site in this chain, there are big differences of scale and the amount of capital and labor that is involved. Um, so the economic lives again would vary according to these sort of differences in scale and capital intensity and labor intensity, really. But like I said, even though leather is seen as a polluting object in the caste discourse, in terms of economy, it is a very profitable sort of a business. I mean, profitable not in the sense of that it produces a large amount of profits, is actually a very capital intensive industry because it requires a lot of land, it requires a lot of water, it requires a lot of resources. It's a labor heavy industry. There is relatively very little mechanization in India compared to countries abroad. So it's a labor intensive industry. But there is still an economic lure for being in the leather industry because India is a net exporter of leather, and there's a lot of scope for the Indian leather, both in terms of uh, the craftsmanship, which is very well regarded in the world, and also in terms of our tanning capacity. We don't have a very good quality of leather per se, comparatively speaking, for the whole world, but we do have very good tanning capacities, and it's actually it's good because we do have a caste based captive workforce which works for very lower rates, uh, which in a lot of cases cannot do anything else because they are bound by caste norms to this sort of a trade. And so, something which is very sort of violent in a sense in terms of labor per se, actually translates into us having very competitive tanning capacities as far as the world economy is concerned. So, a lot of people also get into the leather industry because of this, successful and competitive nature that it has in the world market. Yeah. Also, just a small thing. A lot of what I just described in terms of the structure of the industry is currently getting swamped uh, by the flooding of the market with what is called rexine or PU leather, which is polyurethane leather, which is basically not leather, right? So it is you can call it fake leather, but um, so especially in the domestic market, the demand for leather is expensive. Leather goods are very expensive. So in the domestic market, we now have in some sectors an entire replacement of the smaller leather units with rexine units, with PU units, because that's much cheaper to process. It doesn't involve all these very complicated things of dealing with animal bodies and all of that. It's a pure sort of factory product. It's easier to make, it's cheaper. And so a lot of bigger brands like Bata, for instance, would also are now also majorly dealing in PU and rexine rather than dealing in pure leather. So that's this other kind of segment which is coming in, especially in the domestic market.
Right. I think you've already shown us quite eloquently how the spatial geographical mapping of the industry overlaps very closely with the caste mapping and the labor mapping, starting from the tannery level where you said there is a clear demarcation of which caste group works in which part of the factory, to the rural urban distribution of the leather work that takes place. So clearly there are privileged caste savarna society people who not only are engaged in the leather industry but are also consumers of the leather industry products and sort of keep the industry going. What sorts of logics or rationalizations did you encounter that kind of enables this Savarna society to dissociate itself from the perceived impurity and the perceived pollution of the work and the product itself, which, from what you say, seems to be kind of absorbed by the presence of Dalit labor and the presence of the Dalit body. So, if you can tell us a bit about what sorts of um, rejoinders or logics that people commonly deployed to make sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very difficult question, actually, Srilata, because um, there's a way in which, especially in urban contexts, we sort of talk about caste by not talking about caste, you know. And so, in a lot of conversations that I had on the field, um, it only occurred to me much later when I was reading my field notes that, oh, actually, this person was referring to some caste relationship or some sort of caste norm or caste rule, which was couched so well in like an economic industrial sort of vocabulary that even I, as a researcher who went there looking for caste, only realized it much later, right? Uh, so so, I mean, that's your question about what are the kinds of ways in which people dissociate and mask and sort of literally stall the presence of polluting labor or polluting objects in their lives. It's actually very, very interesting, and I'm still sort of wading through that material in order to figure out. Uh, but I think in the leather industry, that dissociation becomes more and more difficult, precisely because of the overpowering way in which leather has been produced as a polluting object, and the fact that very little has been done uh, by the state, various kinds of state actually, colonial, post-colonial state, by the society, which is predominantly an upper caste society, even by processes like modernity, have not been able to delink leather from its caste status, as has happened with many other kinds of commodities. So, for instance, something like a textile engineer today will hardly face uh, would hardly have to deal with the fact that weaving or cloth making also had its origins in a caste based labor, right? But today somebody who's from whichever caste has or whichever religion has managed to get a degree in textile engineering, for instance, she will not uh, ever probably face the fact that, oh, you must belong to such and such caste if you are doing textile engineering. But that hasn't happened with things like, say, sanitation or things like leather work, you know, uh, because probably it was beneficial for the economy, and again, all sorts of economies. It was beneficial for them to have this captive sort of labor force which is doing a work which nobody else is willing to do, right? So that's one thing which we must keep in mind while talking about the place of, say, the upper caste or the savarnas in an industry like leather, because they are acutely aware that the industry is running because of what they consider untouchable labor. If the Jatav Chamars in UP refuse to do, or if the Dalit Muslims in UP refuse to do this work, the industry will actually not have workers because nobody else is willing to. Maybe castes lower in the hierarchy than the Jatav Chamars will take it up, as has happened in parts of eastern UP. But Badrinarayan's research has shown us that in villages where the Chamars have given up leather work as a part of a panchayat decisions, the Valmikis have stepped in, the Musahars have stepped in, and they have started doing leather work. but that's not the kind of transformation that we are really looking for, right? Uh, so the Savarnas in the industry are very acutely aware of, one, the fact that the industry runs on untouchable labor, and second, that their own status in the industry is a little doubtful. I mean, their own caste status in the industry is a little doubtful, even though they clearly belong to upper caste communities. But the fact that they are involved in leather making by whatever reason, uh, by chance, or due to the skill they had, or due to the capital investment that they have, whatever, uh, they also have to face the consequence of working in a dirty, polluted industry, right? Uh, so there are various ways in which it is covered up. Um, One is, of course, that we must think about how the upper castes entered this industry to begin with. When it's traditionally been considered a lower caste trade, um, where did the upper castes really get in? And one easy answer to this is that, at least in my field, because I'm sure that there is a different narrative, say, in the tanneries and the leather industry in Tamil Nadu, for instance. There's definitely a very different narrative to this in the leather industry in Punjab, which has again a very strong Dalit movement and a very different Dalit movement because of the existence of Sikhism, and the relationship between caste and Sikhism being slightly different from what it is between Hinduism and caste, right? So I can speak for UP, especially Western UP, where I have worked. Um, there, the entry of upper castes happens happens at the level of ownership, mostly. Um, Somewhat in the pre-colonial times, definitely, but it is in the colonial period, especially after the revolt of 1857, that we see the British getting interested in setting up these large tanneries and factories to take care of their military needs, basically. And that's the beginning of what we today see as the formal industrial structure within the leather industry. Um, and it was the British who, I mean, they, the British state owned some of these tanneries and factories, but some of these were also opened up for ownership by the Indians, because of course the British also needed capital investment and so on and so forth. And so naturally, who had capital in the late 1800s or the early 1900s? Who had capital? It were the upper caste communities, the Khatris, the Vaishya, uh, some Brahmins also, especially in places like West Bengal. Brahmins had a lot of capital, right, from land and other things. Um, and so they got into owning some of these tanneries, um, and factories, and that continued, till the time of partition, or sometimes even after that. Actually, in places like Agra, there are some owners who own their factories from before partition. um, so that is one way in which the upper castes got in. The other way was again something which the colonial state perpetuated, which is the colonial state's obsession with getting in, slightly educated Indians into administration, right? And that shows itself in the leather industry as well, um, because they realize they need someone to manage the factory. They need someone to take care of these workers who really don't know anything, when actually they were running the production. But the native elite, as well as the British uh, sort of administrative logic and caste logic and racial logic all comes together to say that the worker is not scientific, that the worker doesn't know what he's doing. He may know it by rote, but he doesn't really understand what's happening, right? So let's put a manager over the workers. Let's put somebody who's trained in chemistry over these workers, because ultimately tanning is a chemical process. And like I said, it's in the early 1900s that it became a chemical process, right? And so that level of control that vegetable tanning gave to the workers who intimately knew the process was taken away from them when it became a chemical process, when you had to have a degree in chemistry to understand tanning or to teach tanning to workers. And so all of these changes, now again, who will be a chemistry trained manager? Who will have a higher degree in chemistry in late 1800s, early 1900s in India, right? So these were upper caste people who were sent abroad by who were sent to England and to Germany by the colonial state to learn in tanneries there, to learn in factories there, to study in places like Northampton and Leeds, to study leather chemistry in places like this, come back and manage tanneries, manage the colonial tanneries uh, for India, for the British here. And so that's the second way in which the upper caste got entry, not as owners, not as workers, because they didn't have the capital to be owners and they didn't want to do the work that the workers were doing. And so this middle rung comes in, which continues even in the post colonial state, because again, we figured that leather is a profitable business and you do need that scientifically trained manager in between. So that continues. Um, a significant shift in the ownership per se happens at the time of partition, especially in places like Agra, which was severely affected by partition in the sense that uh, cities like Agra and Kanpur had a significant Muslim population, right, because of their Mughal and the Nawab history that they had. And so we did have a significant amount of ownership of, smaller leather tanning or smaller factories. The ownership did lie with either Muslims or even with some members of the Dalit community. Like I said, in places like Agra, the Jatav presence is very, very strong. Even in terms of politics and economics. So, for example, Sudha Pai writes this in her book that um, the the older Dalit sort of parties like the Scheduled Caste Federation, for instance, even the beginning phase of the BSP, or actually the beginning phase of BAMSEF before PSP, a lot of the funding for these organizations came from, Dalits who owned leather factories or smaller leather units, but they were cash rich and they were able to send their children to school. Their children were able to get an education. So very prominent leaders like BP Maurya, for instance, were sons of people who owned leather tanneries and leather factories. So Jatavs had a presence like that in places like Agra, and thus some of them were also able to own their own factories, right? And Owen Lynch has excellent ethnography. It's an old ethnography. It's done in the 60s in Agra, but it's an excellent ethnography of the Agra footwear market. And so I'm actually quoting from him when I say this, that what happens is that at the time of partition, uh, a lot of the Muslims had to, of course, leave the country. Uh, that left a big gap in ownership. Um, and what happened was that simultaneously, um, a lot of upper caste merchant communities, like the Punjabi Khatris, also the Vaishyas, came from Pakistan, especially places like Lahore, and settled in places like Agra and Kanpur and Delhi. And this was a major shift in the way that the industry was structured because they took over a lot of units which were left behind by the Muslims. And because the because these communities, these upper caste communities, were already doing very large scale businesses in places like Karachi and Lahore, which are again business towns, right? These are cities which run on the business community. And so these upper caste Khatri Punjabi communities had capital, even if they had lost some capital in partition. They had more capital than other communities. More importantly, they had access to capital, right? They knew how to access banks, how to access community networks to get loans and get money. um, they knew how to do business at a much larger scale than the Dalit or the Muslim owner or entrepreneur was doing pre-partition in Agra or in Kanpur, right? So the upper caste communities completely take over the industry post-partition, and slowly what we see in the next couple of decades is that ownership also goes out of the hands of the Dalit owners in these places, because they were running at such a small scale that it was very easy for them to actually lose their ownership to this relatively big capital. I mean, today when we say big capital, we of course mean like really big capital. So we're not talking about that, but relatively speaking, the these Punjabi Khatri communities had much more access to capital. And what Owen Lynch says very crucially is that because of their caste status, they had a better reputation in the market. You know, people trusted them more. So the money lenders, the banks, the government, and they had of course their networks in every level of the government, of bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And this is literally how caste works, right? Through these, not just kinship networks, but also these sorts of social networks that you create, where when you go to apply for a bank, the officer is also from your caste, right? And so the chances of you getting at least a sympathetic hearing is much more than what would happen if a Dalit entrepreneur or a Dalit person goes to ask for a loan, right? And so today in Agra, almost the entire footwear industry is run by the Punjabi Khatris, so to say. Um, and so that was a significant shift in, so partition was actually a significant shift in taking ownership away from Muslim and Dalits. And I think that impacted the way in which caste sort of sustained itself in the industry. It impacted the way in which caste was organized in the industry after partition, you know, because then what did these Dalits and Muslims do? They became workers, because that's the trade they knew, and they became workers in the industry. So, anyways, we had a predominance of Dalit and Muslim workers uh, because of the caste system. Um, it got reinforced because of colonial practices, and then it sort of again solidified after partition because they also lost ownership, right? So, you know, we don't see figures like BP Maurya anymore, for instance, because there are no owners amongst the Dalit community. So, so that's the that's the various ways in which upper castes have entered the industry. And so, you know, why I went into this long narrative was precisely because I think capital is the biggest way in which they dissociate themselves with the pollution of the industry, because um, uh, their class and caste position, as well as their position as owners of capital, literally shields them from any. I mean, they'll of course not face any caste discrimination, but it also shields them from any sort of social discrimination or humiliation, um, if at all it happens, is sort of staved away because. Literally because money has no smell. And I'm again using a much used proverb, which many anthropologists have also used in doing their fieldwork, but it's true, right? So one is that. The second is that uh, what I mean, literally, what happens is that their caste position um, doesn't allow any sort of um, any of the pollution of working with leather literally stick to their self or their bodies, you know. So they may be a upper caste, they may be some, an upper caste person may be an upper caste who's working in the leather industry, and he may face um, I'm specifically saying he because it's predominantly a male industry, and he may face a couple of jokes in amongst his friends. He may face a little taunt from his parents, saying, "Arey, why are you doing this work? Do something more respectable." but at the end of the day, he remains an upper caste, and that cannot be taken away. And that's the interesting bit about the way in which objects and bodies interact under the framework of caste, literally. That you may have an upper caste owning a leather factory, but the pollution will not stick to him because of his caste, right? And you may have a Jatav who has never worked with leather, right? But he's ridiculed as a Jatav. He's ridiculed as a leather worker, although he has never really done leather work, right? And so I mean, at some level, that dissociation. I mean, there is no active dissociation because your caste does it for you, right? Working with leather doesn't take away your caste, and that's true for everyone, right? So caste stays, and there is a way in which and then there are physical ways in which you manifest this. So while talking to a lot of owners, um, they would they would I won't say that they don't go on the factory floor. They do go on the factory floor. It's their factory after all. um, but they're not involved in the actual work of it. In fact, um, when I went to some of these factories and tanneries through the owner, and actually that's the only way to do it because this is also a very fairly closed industry. So um, they'll insist on taking you around and showing you things, and then you have to find other ways to uh, sort of make their presence less important and talk to other people in the factory. But when they would take me around, and this is where my caste comes in because um, my caste is clear from my name, uh, and also I go there as a researcher, so I have a different identity. In some senses, me being a researcher is also a sort of shield that I had around me. And of course, caste solidarities were made in the very first 5 minutes of the conversation, right? So uh, I shared my caste with a lot of these owners. Um, and so it was because of our surnames, it was immediately recognizable. Um, Sometimes I shared uh, location or um, schools that I went to. Um, we had common friends, and so on and so forth. Uh, and so there was a lot of immediate sociality between the owners and the managers and me, based on caste and class, and then other things piled on. And so when they would take me around the factory or the tannery, um, I mean, they would tell me to not touch, to see from a little afar, right? Um, to not be too interested in, in what is the chemical going into the what actually. Whereas those were the things that I was the most interested in actually. And so I could see how they would be walking through their own factory or their own tannery when they were doing it on their own, right? With this level of distance, with this level of physical as well as sort of metaphysical distance that, uh, yeah, I pay for this, I earn from this, I'm not touching this, right? Um, that was one. And so, like I said, I literally had to read into all of this to understand how they distance themselves, right? uh, in a lot of the times the interview started, uh, especially when I was going through some common contacts, right? So when the owner talking to me also knew someone I knew, and so they could locate me socially and in terms of caste and class. Often the interview started with them asking me, why are you even doing this, right? Why why couldn't you study something else? uh, you don't even come from a family which deals in leather. uh, why not study something better, right? And these are owners, people who are earning from leather, who are telling me, why are you even why study this, there is so much else to study. right? So it's it's there that that the distance and the effort that goes into maintaining that distance is palpable, is visible. When even my uh, presence as an upper caste person, my presence in a or my interest in understanding leather makes them uncomfortable, right? And I wouldn't say that it's their fault. It's not. I mean, they are part uh, of of a much larger structure of caste which is dictating these relationships, where they are so, in that very Marxist sense, they're so dissociated from the product that they are not even making, but they are enabling, right? uh, it's almost as if, if not asked, they don't want to say that they deal with leather. um, at the same time, they are very well sort of respected and established people in these cities in Agra and Kanpur. They attract capital. They go abroad to sell their products, and that gets them a lot of esteem and so on and so forth. So it's for them also. It's a very complicated position to be in, of course. The problem is that they don't recognize this as caste labor. I think that's the problem that you can attribute to the owners. That uh, given all of these complications, they still don't recognize it as a caste-based labor.
I think you've touched upon so many interesting things here, many of which I wanted to bring up myself, and you've already covered them. So, the intersection, the convergence of caste logic and racial logic and colonial governance that created the current form of the leather industry in terms of, which caste groups have what position within the industry, and then the structural barriers that you touched upon in terms of not being able to reconfigure caste relations within the industry because everything works through kinship networks and social networks. um, and then of course the tensions generated by your own subject position in doing this research. So keeping all of this in mind, would you say it is possible to imagine a future for leather work or the leather industry um, that is somehow just in terms of caste, just, where there is some sort of caste justice or where caste power is somewhat absent? Is it even possible to imagine such a future for this sort of work?
Well, uh, I have no sort of ready answer for this question, simply because um, I think at least one level of solution has to be at the really macro level, where we start of course, annihilation of caste kind of logic is one logic, the ideal sort of way. But we also need to think about how to operationalize that. And while leather is a specific kind of commodity and the industry is set up in a specific caste connotation, um, it is still within the larger society, right? So um, I don't think much will change at one level. I don't think much will change within the industry without having a larger society wide conversation on not just caste, but also the relationship that caste has to things like education, employment, what is thought of as skill, and uh, also, of course, everyday sociality. You know. So, for instance, I mean, why am I saying that? Because what is if I were to frame your question differently, uh, what is the problem of caste in the leather industry? If we were to ask that in order to reach some sort of a just position, then the problem of caste, if you ask me, within the leather industry um, is that labor, like physical labor, has been made distinct from a sort of uh, knowledge-based labor, has been made distinct from uh, you know labor in terms or work in terms of ownership, right? So this sort of a division of work, which is not simply a mental manual division really, but works on the lines of that, uh, where leather work is a different, has been configured as a different caste, class, skill activity than, say, managing a factory, than owning a factory. It is in these divisions that caste really survives. Okay, so what ends up happening is that workers invariably come from Dalit castes or Dalit Muslim castes, um, which is also, I mean, and, and of course, the managers and owners come from other castes. So, if I were to solve this or talk about how to make this more just, an obvious solution would be to say, let's democratize the workforce, right? Let's get everyone into the workforce, every caste. But it doesn't work like that because it's not that simple. Because what we have also seen, and there is lots of work on this, so I mean, this is not something I'm saying for the first time, but caste communities have also become uh, sort of communities for the generation of employment and livelihood, right? And we have also seen very strong assertions by caste groups saying we want to continue with this trade because it gives us employment, right? So we have seen the Safai Karamchari kind of movements, for instance, where Safai Karamcharis have refused to give up that activity um, in favor of doing something else, or have also sort of resisted the entry of other caste groups into, or that won't happen, but even the proposal, the entry of other caste groups in some parts has been resisted by the Safai Karamcharis themselves because they see it as a loss of employment. And that's very justified actually, given the kind of employment situation we have in the country and given the fact that we actually do very little skill training in leather specifically, but also other kinds of industrial production. In leather, I can say there's very little skill training for workers that is available, right? So, a lot, even in my field, for instance, I have seen um, groups in Kanpur who hold on very strongly to the fact that it is us who pick up animal carcasses in the city. And even within our group, there are territorially sort of divided areas. So you will not come into my territory, I will not go into your territory, right? The moment you talk about opening this up, right, whether it is in terms of getting in people from all castes into it, or whether it is in terms of opening it up as a tender thing by the government, um, or it is like making a cooperative or something, there's always this threat of loss of employment, right? And unfortunately, it is through caste that we have ensured employment for people, right? So there's also that we have to consider, because somebody who, because of caste and class reasons, uh, did not get a formal education or had to leave a formal education and got trained in the occupation that the parents were doing. And this is how a lot of almost all the workers learn leather work like this, because it happens in their houses. They first start with, pasting the sole onto the shoe. That's the first thing that children are taught in the house. It's the simplest thing to do. Just paste glue and put the two parts together. And then they keep, moving up. They would do a little bit of stitching, and then they would do a little bit of polishing, and then, eventually start learning. Now, if you say that, you know, uh, let's get in more people to take this person's place. That's a misplaced kind of justice, really, right? Um, the other big problem in this, of course, is where will you find those other people who will take this worker's place, right? Because that's the bigger problem of caste, that nobody is um, willing to learn this work. So in leather training institutions, it's not as if we don't see upper caste take admissions. They do. They do take admissions in leather engineering, in leather chemistry, in even in footwear manufacturing courses. They do. Uh, but they, because again of caste reasons and class reasons, they mostly end up being managers in factories rather than workers. Um, or they sort of shift to, uh, some other part of the industry. They shift to merchandising, they shift to designing, which are, not, which are the non-polluting parts of the industry. So where will you find these workers who are willing to learn leather tanning or leather work and then do it in a factory, right? So I don't think the easy sort of solution lies in saying let's mix up the workforce, right? Something else needs to be done, and I think I do not know how to operationalize this, frankly, but we do need to delink leather from its caste connotation, while at the same time saving livelihoods. And not just livelihoods, but also saving a certain sort of skill set which we have, which this community has in working with leather. And a lot of them take a lot of pride in that because they are able to separate the discrimination and the humiliation from the skill that they have, right? And they want to continue with that skill, right? So we need to preserve that level, I mean, that sense of ownership and skill and livelihood. Uh, we need to preserve that while sort of doing away with the discrimination, the humiliation, the degradation. Uh, so we need to somehow figure out, and this is, I mean, this is not just a one-time process or a one institution process. I mean, somewhere state, democracy, modernity, some process has to get in to sort of figure out how to dealing uh, sewage or leather or uh, bodily wastes or dead bodies, to delink all of these things from the logic of caste. And that's, I mean, I really do not know how that will happen. But at an everyday level, I can say that a lot of these factories and tanneries would really take a step forward if they start acknowledging that uh, the product that they make is the uh, is the result of Dalit labor, right? And there are various ways to acknowledge that. Give them better facilities, um, make it I mean, recognize the skill that they come in with. Recognize the fact that you don't have to train these people. You are not spending money and time in training people. You're getting a pre-trained worker. Um, Recognize that fact. I mean, convert that recognition into material benefits. Convert it into symbolic benefits. Uh, in Kanpur, for instance, which has a very strong history of a left movement, of a workers' movement, especially in the textile factories. Um, Chitra Joshi writes about this in such a powerful way, where of course she majorly looks at the textile workers, but in her work, the leather workers make these occasional appearances, and she will talk about how uh, inside the factory, in the living spaces, in the markets, the leather workers would be discriminated by the textile workers because, again, the textile workers would be majoritarily upper caste, right? And so the leather workers would not be made a part of the larger movement as well, or they would have to sit separately when the dharna is happening. So I'd read this when I was on the field, and so I asked some of the older workers, "Do you remember that period? Were you there in the 70s, 60s, 70s?" And And they confirmed what Rita Joshi is writing, because they said, we were never called to a lot of these meetings. We were never really, when we went, nobody would talk to us. Um, and so, uh, and they were like, while even if there was a large scale factory strike going on, we would continue working, you know, because we didn't have a place there in the strike, so we might as well keep earning, right? So we would shut the factory doors, tannery doors, and we would keep working inside. Now, which means that, it's a larger societal level sort of change that we are talking about. And I think the owners would do well, and to sort of uh, make some sort of symbolic gesture and symbolic space within the factory setting to acknowledge this sort of a politics, Uh, in none of the, I mean, this is too much to expect, but in none of these factories or any space uh, did I find any sort of poster or statue or any symbol of, say, any Dalit icon or leader, or any sense that this is a Dalit workspace. It wasn't there. Whereas, for instance, it's not as if this doesn't happen. A lot of mochis, for instance, uh, who simply sit on roadsides and have these very informal settlements, a lot of them would have a Ravidas poster on their walls, you know, or one such sort of icon. Um, I found that singularly missing in these spaces, and it wasn't a surprise, because I understand that these spaces are managed, of course, very differently. They are managed through an upper caste logic. They are they are sort of constructed to erase caste, right? Because you also have to erase caste for the consumers who don't want to think of their like really plush handbag as a polluted product. So this whole erasure of caste, I think, creates uh, a major sort of problem in even addressing the fact that uh, you are relying on a caste-based labor. So yeah, I mean, I really do not have an answer for that, like a comprehensive answer for that.
Yeah, but I think you have given us sort of openings into what directions we could be moving in. I think what you're suggesting is a very fundamental unsettling of our ideas of purity and pollution that are sort of injected into the Savarna psyche almost from birth. And it sounds like a mammoth colossal task that Savarna society has ahead of itself to not only not erase caste from these material objects and from our everyday experiences or from these workspaces, but also to confront it in a way that we can at least start to think about annihilating it.
Yeah, if I can just add something, because it just occurred to me while you were speaking. Uh, some interesting things are happening in this regard, Uh, so, uh, for instance, there is this, what do I say? I don't know if it's a company uh, or an establishment. I don't know how to characterize it, but something called Chamar Studio has come up in Bombay, I think, which is run by this person called Sudhir Rajbhar, who I believe comes from the leatherworking community, who is trying to sort of set up leatherwork in a different way, you know now, of course, this is not the factory or the tannery that he's setting up. It is called a studio, right? uh, but I think that nomenclature itself does so much, uh, so he's trying to sort of get in the labor part of the process, uh, get it into more prominence, um, give a center space uh, to the workers and to the skill that they have, and also, I mean, brand leather as something that the Chamar community is producing,
And can take
right?
ownership
Now I
of,
do
like, it's a brand that,
that can
yeah.
take ownership of the brand,
Mm.
right? So I do not know how this will play out. I have not been to their studio or anything, but it struck me as one something different that is happening from uh, what has happened so far. So that's one way, you know. I don't know if it's a replicable model or not, but that's at least one sort of one example we have of possibly how to think of work and the relationship between work, caste, and market differently. The other, of course, is in in outside the realm of industrial production. If you go into popular culture, uh, there is there are very interesting uh, sort of songs and videos from, say, the Chamar community, and I'm sure all other caste groups also have it, um, which do talk about the pride that one feels in being a chamar, in being a leather worker. Uh, what immediately comes to mind is, of course, Jinni Mahi and her song "Danger Chamar," which is perhaps sort of exploded on the cultural front in that sense. It's like really a popular song, and it captures that imagination of, the chamar not being a sort of degraded, downtrodden presence, but a danger chamar, right? And of course, it also resonates then when Chandrasekhar Azad Ravan puts up that board outside his village which says the Great Chamar, right? Um, so there are, I mean, those things happening outside the industrial space, really. We have to find a way to put these in conversation. We have to find a way. The Chamar studio is probably one link between uh, these sorts of things. But um, so, yeah, I mean, we could look to uh, spaces like these outside the industry to think of ways uh, in which we can at least start a conversation within the industrial spaces.
Well, Shivani, I think you've left us with a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much for the work that you have done and you continue to do, and for taking the time to share it with us. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from you and talking to you, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Srilata. I don't think I need to be thanked for the work that I have done. It's very, very minuscule and it needs to be done. That's the least that I can do is, uh, just uh, visit some of these spaces and learn from them. Um, and there's so much more to be done, but I'm really glad that we had this conversation and helps me also sort of revisit parts of my field which I may have uh, sort of not looked at so far. So thank you so much for this, Srilata. I really enjoyed doing this.
It's been a pleasure. You have been listening to Confronting Cast. During the academic year of 2020-2021, we will be releasing fortnightly episodes of this podcast that you can listen to on all major hosting platforms, including SoundCloud. To know more about our panels, seminars, and workshops, visit kcl.ac.uk/KII/events.